Welcome to Grand Slam Tennis Lessons. This one is entitled The First Serve and First Strike versus the Return of Serve. And as is normal on Grand Slam Tennis Lessons, we have international experts that you can have access to, which is quite amazing. So we have Thomas Mensinger, head of tennis for Gladiator Tennis Training, owner of fieldtennis.net, one of the most insightful and innovative tennis coaches around, and Robert Calvo from Florida, USA, only 100 degrees there with a little bit of humidity, taking time off court, one of the highest profile and respected coaches in all of America, without overdoing you, Robert, and a master tennis practitioner, mental strength certificates, and many other things. So, as I think I said last time, you've probably forgotten more than I've learned. So, no, seriously, we thank you for being on court. So this is the first serve, first strike versus the return of serve, and I probably classify it as the tennis equivalent of the gunslingers shootout, except in this instance, the person you're playing against is not on equal terms. So you can decide where on the white line you serve from. You can decide where you're going to hit the ball, how hard, medium or slow, what type of slice. You have everything in your favour. What could possibly go wrong? And just to position a little further, at the elite level, this is like 40-30 match point, about to win a Grand Slam, which has been your ambition since you held a racket, or equal feelings, winning club championships for the first time, or even about to serve out against a person you've never beaten. And these feelings are all the same. And it's probably not too different if you're serving to save something also, but I think the pressure is more on when you're trying to close out and win. So that's where we are, and I said, what could possibly go wrong? So, Thomas, first of all, you have the guy at your mercy. He has no idea what you're going to do. You've got first serve, first strike. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, my opponent can get lucky. I can miss the first serve. The wind can blow and so on. So I am in control as much as I can be, but not 100%.
Okay, so let me just go to my favorite plank analogy. You're on the plank 30 meters in the air. Now you're doing the first serve. What could go wrong?
Yes. Yes, so just to introduce a little bit the first strike idea, it's the key is that we don't look only at the serve, like what are we going to do with the serve, but the goal is that how are we going to set up our forehand, which is usually the better stroke. So the first strike is a pattern of first serve and attacking with the forehand. So my initial goal, my initial intention is how will I serve so that I get the ball back so that I can attack with the forehand. That is
perfect.
Brief overview of the first strike idea. And
just to take that further forward then, the whole psychology is it's a two-step sequence. It's not a one step and let's see what happens. Let's hope he doesn't get the ball back. It's we expect it to come back and we're planning for it to be on our forehand.
Yes, we are planning, we are anticipating, we know roughly where our opponent tends to return, to which side. So let's say if we are on the juice side and we serve out wide the first serve, then by default, most players are going to go cross court or down the middle because it's easier for them to return that way rather than go down the line. So if we are right-handers, if the ball goes cross court, that's right to our forehand. If it goes down the middle, we just have to move away a little bit. And for example, hit to the open court, that would be our default intention. But of course, if our opponent manages to hit to our backhand, then we cannot follow up with our initial plan. So we plan for, the perfect scenario, but we must be ready for plan B if necessary.
Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about maths and geometry. If you're serving from the deuce court and you're serving wide, clearly they've got three choices. One is to return serve sort of deep at your feet in the middle, which is probably the best return.
Yeah.
If they do it angled to your forehand, initially you could say, well, that's dangerous, but you can only hit it parallel to the line, which means they probably have more chance of getting it. Whereas if they return serve to your backhand, which you might think would be the weakest shot, you now have an opportunity for an angle, which means that they have much further to run.
Yes, correct. But assuming that your backhand is not as good as your forehand, we are assuming in this case that you're not so good at hitting that angle. And so,
yeah. Okay, so do you have a favorite recommendation? I know that in a match you'd be seeing strengths and weaknesses and what their favorite shots are, etc. But do you have from the deuce court, do you have a favorite position where you would serve to and then stand?
Like the highest probability, I think, would be to go in the body with a slight slice if you're skilled enough to pull it off, so that your opponent actually has to move towards the outside of the court. So you're serving to their backhand if they're right-handers.
Okay, you're serving to sort of their left hip just to make it...
Yes, the left hip, and then they have to move away, and they're actually moving away from the center of the court. And because they don't have enough space to swing, they're kind of block the ball back down the middle. And so then you run around. If it's going down the middle, you run around and you hit the forehand to the open court. And because they had to move away slightly before they lost half a second to recover, and this is the little advantage that you can get from this serve and first strike scenario.
Okay. And then just to lead you, I agree. I think that's exactly right, because they don't really have a natural swing in that instance if you get it right. But clearly the margin of error for your serve is quite fine. And if you get it wrong, you're just serving straight into their forehand hitting zone. So this requires practice and specific drills, and we'll come to later.
Yes, true, but it is a first serve.
Huh?
It is a first serve, so it's fairly fast. We're assuming it's fairly fast.
That's true.
So it will not usually result in a big return.
That's true.
Yeah.
Because the psychology is they are expecting a first serve.
Yes.
They're expecting to be more defensive. They're not looking to get onto it like they would do for a second serve.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what would you do if you're serving from the advantage court?
From the advantage court, typically you could serve to the backhand if that's your preferred serve and the backhand is the weaker shot of your opponent. So you can just hit it with slight topspin or some rotation and hit it out wide. You're expecting a return that's going cross court or down the middle. You can run around and then go for the inside in forehand into the open court.
Great. Before bringing Robert in, I just want to ask you whether you would, in practice, so practice before the match, practice a serve that you only pull out at big points, like the serve you were just saying, okay? So we know that whatever level you are, you pick up on it, or you should pick up on each other's game quite quickly.
Yeah.
So if you've introduced your first serve at a big point regularly, it loses all aspect of surprise. And as this is kind of a military doctrine-led program, one of Clausewitz's 9 principles of war was the element of surprise. So would you do that or not?
Yes, I would call that I have a ace up my sleeve. So sometimes I would hide a certain serve that I wouldn't use it much, like the one I mentioned before on the deuce side, this one that's curving a little bit into my opponent's body. I wouldn't show that one until 4-all or 5-all.
Okay.
I wouldn't show it.
And perhaps if you are, really quite a decent player, the equivalent shot onto the advantage side is also a little slice that also goes into their left hip, but tucks them up on the backhand. Yes?
Yes, or a topspin serve, a kick serve that is going to their forehand and then in their body. So again, they're moving away.
I'm brave, but I'm not that brave to do that.
Yes, so maybe just right at them a good kick serve that they have to move away, and then just thinking I'm going to attack the next ball with my forehand.
Okay. I probably want to just set the scene. Hello, Robert.
How are you?
Very, very good. We've got an iffy internet signal into Florida. Perhaps it's 100 degrees heat and the internet doesn't like playing either. Just want to summarize what we said so far, which is, whilst it appears that nothing can go wrong, something called tension and pressure and risk can come into play. And I want to address that as part of training before we actually get into the tactics and the shots and how we're going to practice it. Because probably the most important part of the work, in my opinion, for the first serve and the first strike is what you do off the court. And we would call it, you've got to work on the inside before you can work on the outside. Robert's trying to come in again. Yeah, perfect.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. And it still doesn't.
Oh, okay,
it's
good.
amazing
I had
how
some internet. So I think
the internet signal was very strong and it seems very weak. But gosh, it is weak. It just popped off again. So as we were saying, the most important part, I think, is to work on the inside before you work on the outside for your first serve and first strike. And by working on the inside means that under this period of risk, danger and pressure, you are excited by what is to come rather than fearful. And between fearful and excited is anxious, nervous, which is probably playing not to lose, and cautious confidence, which is not playing, boldly, not trying to close out. So the first part of the training, before I think we even step on court, is for you to know that and believe that, and you have evidence to back up belief that you can raise your game, i.e. play better than your best at these moments of time. Your brain and your body is given superpowers. You can harness these superpowers and do things that you are unable to do during the rest of the points. So I think that's the first and the fundamental thing, because if you're not at the baseline about to serve, knowing that this is your stage and God-given time, and you're about to close out, then everything else that we're talking about becomes, I think, more of a challenge. Okay? So we do have some training for that.
yes, yeah.
This is our equivalent of big point training.
Long distance to USA.
I understood or heard.
Robert, if you can hear us, we can't hear you. This is our equivalent of big point training. You've got to be still and calm, relaxed, and let process take its course.
Yeah. Can't control everything.
So, just to recap so far, the first and most important part of training is to view this opportunity as exciting, as a chance to fight, as a chance to close out and win, rather than the opposite, which is fearful, freezing or flighting, and therefore choking. So if you haven't done that bit of training, anything else that you might think about is going to be a waste of time, I think. The second thing that we have then discussed is to view the first serve and first strike as a two-step sequence, and you're setting up the serve in order to get it onto your forehand in order to do the forehand down the line. And we can either do that by serving into somebody's left hip, which tucks them up. It's not a natural stroke. They're likely to give you a forehand. Or on the other side, a kicker into their forehand or a slice into their backhand. And this is 15th time lucky as well.
I moved to a different spot, so hopefully, I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Great. This
Okay,
looks
good.
great.
Let's try this.
Okay, so I'm going to summarize again and then bring Robert in. Okay, so Robert, what we've discussed so far is before we actually get into the tactics of the shot or the technique of the shot, which I'll come to in a second, the most important part of the training is to view this undoubted risk, danger and pressure as an exciting opportunity. If you approach it fearful or nervous, anything that comes next is likely to default. So we have in Gladiator training that wherever you are on the continuum between fear, anxious, nervous, cautious, confidence and excitement, there is trained to move you towards being a big point player. And clearly, if you knew and you had evidence to back it up in practice that you had superpowers that you could harness to raise your game at these precise points, then why wouldn't you be excited to have your opportunity to shine and close out? So that's the very first part of the training. The second part that Thomas was leading on to, and then I will ask you to respond, is both the tactics and the shot. So the tactic is that you approach the first serve and first strike as a two-step process, and that you're doing the serve in order to set up a forehand. So from the juice course, if you're reasonably skilled, our preference, and we're not saying it's God-given right, is that you would serve a slice into somebody's left hip, which means they're tucked up. They hit it with their forehand, not a natural shot, and you're very likely to get a forehand. And from the advantage court, you might have a choice of a kick serve into somebody's forehand, a slice into somebody's hip, or even a kick serve wide. Any of those three is likely to give you a forehand. And prior to that, we discussed that if you serve wide to their forehand, they could hit it cross court, but you're now going to hit it down the line and they've got more chance to scamper and get it back. If they hit it wide to your backhand, you can now do an angle from your weaker backhand, but they're going to have to scamper a lot further to get it. So over to you now from your perspective and what you teach your customers.
Well, I agree with you that the serve, I like to say that I teach, you're not done with your serve until you've hit the third ball. Too many times players hit the ball and they especially get in a situation where you have players who have a basket and you're hitting balls over and over and over and you're not expecting the ball to come back. So you get into that habit of practicing tons and tons of serves, and you see that many times, you know, we're looking at the US Open, even these very skilled tennis players at times, they will hit a very good serve, especially if you have a strong serve, sort of not really expecting the ball to come back. But I always like to tell my players that you're not done serving until you've hit the third ball. Okay, so that includes getting your feet in order, expecting the ball, and doing many of the things that Thomas has talked about in the videos. You know, setting yourself up with the forehand, and this probably applies more to the players who are the big servers, who sort of go for it and sort of think that, okay, I will serve my way out of this and not really think about the next term. And during these pressure situations, you know, you're very tight. You're not moving your feet as quickly as you normally would. So, you know, during practice and especially during practice that involve keeping score and there's some skin to it, that you're moving your feet, because generally speaking, that's what we have to do. We have to overcome something that is a realistic thing in tennis. And of course we can't do a full match, but we can make something similar to that scenario.
Very good. My two takeaways there. Again, just to picture the scene, you could be serving so nervous and tight that you can hardly grip the racket and your feet don't want to operate. And as I said, as part of our training, we ought to be, because we're excited about what's coming on, not be in that case. So if you're trained, you already have a massive advantage against somebody that's untrained. But
exactly.
As part of your training, you will be training the sequence, not training the serve. And I think that is a massive coaching point that few people do. Would you agree, Thomas? Don't have to agree as ever.
Yes, possibly. I mean, as Robert said, there's oftentimes too much emphasis when you work on the serve, then you just work on your serve, rather than work on your serve and something that, you know, is going to come back. So what are your possible options? What are the possible replies from your opponent, and what are your answers? And the more times you go through these patterns, the more quickly you are going to respond when this happens on the court in the match. So you won't think about what I have to do.
I was about to say,
the
less you think,
your subconscious, from your memory, you're just going to respond very quickly with your next shot.
Right.
And possibly dictate the point.
Intuitive, thinking less on autopilot, rather than thinking a lot and mechanical, and it's going to go wrong. Robert, any drills that you do specifically, whether they be Gladiator ones or your own, particularly points that can add a little bit of skin in the game, as you say?
Yeah, to go back to, I don't want to go ahead and say that the technical part isn't important. I just want to make a little clarification. I want to go ahead and make sure that my player, using the basket or whatever the situation is able to go ahead and do the proper technique. But as quickly as possible, I want them to get away from the basket so that it ends up being a realistic situation. So the thing that I like to do is I like to put my players in a tiebreak situation, and I want them to, for example, I might have them in a scoring position where it is 5-1. I would like to see my player close. Too many times we focus on the player coming back. I want to see, the most difficult thing is, can my player close the match, okay? So I'll put him in a tiebreak or her in a tiebreak situation where the score is perhaps 5-1 or something like that. Are you able to close it? You have this lead. What are you going to do? Are you going to relax? Are you going to miss 2 or 3 balls and then get tense and tight and make the situation worse? So I like to put them in a situation where they have the advantage. And what are you going to do? Because too many times we work on the player coming back. And you see that over and over, where the players are in a, 5-1 down, and they, you sort of have nothing to lose. So you go ahead and you hit more freely, or sort of a little bit more relaxed. But the thing that is the most difficult thing in tennis by far, and we need to practice that, can you win? Can you close? What are you doing? And the more times we put players in situations where they have to practice this, that is an advantage. So I would have my players play in a live situation. I would avoid the, can you hit targets left and right? That's important, but can you hit the targets and then finish out the point in a score of 5-1?
Perfect.
I need to see the full game of tennis, not just, I know you can serve the targets well, but can you then go ahead and play after you've hit the targets?
Yeah, perfect. I'm going to do an analogy to the Ryder Cup in golf, is that it's easier for some reason to putt to save the hole than it is to putt and close out and win the hole.
Yes.
I have my own theories as to why it's easier to play to save than it is to play to win. Robert, Thomas, why is it easier?
Because when we're ahead, then if we lose from there, then we see it as our own failure, because we had an opportunity and it seems like we wasted it. Whereas if we are behind, and we lose it, it doesn't look like we've wasted an opportunity. And so it seems like we almost have something and then we lose it, and that's why we get into this stressful situation, because we don't want to lose something that we almost have. Whereas when you're behind, you don't have anything, so you don't feel that you're losing anything, you just want to gain something.
Yeah, Tom, Robert?
Something like that.
I agree with that. And I think the other thing is, when we're actually playing, and even when we're practicing, we don't practice the ability to win. We don't put ourselves in a situation. So you have many very competitive juniors who are playing very good matches, but they're not learning how to win. You want to go ahead and try to figure out how can you go ahead and close out matches, because you want to be able to successfully close out a match at every level. If you are a great junior and you are playing against 18 years old and you're 14 and you can play against 18-year-old players, it was great that you played, but more than likely you're going to lose. The more important thing is, can you stay within your age group and figure out a way to win? So I think we don't do that enough. We play hard, we do all these things, and we can go and say, yeah, I fought hard, I did well, I played against this player, but I don't put myself in positions to practice winning. It's something that we have to do.
Perfect. I'm going to say, because there's this phrase that's used time and time again, which I am totally anti against, which is you learn from your losses. And it's like experience the death of 1,000 cuts over years by your narrow losses and learn how to win. Whereas, and I'm going to throw it back to you, I reckon you learn more by your wins, because then you learn how to win.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And you look at in soccer or football, as you say, you see the same teams winning over and over and over, who are winning the UEFA Cup, who are winning the Barclays League, and so on. These clubs have a history of winning. It's in their DNA. It's not by chance. They have done it over and over. You have a different group of players, but they're still winning because they have that winning culture. And you can gain so much more from winning, because, yeah, okay, I lost. It's wonderful, but I'm learning essentially how to lose.
It's just so fantastic, this conversation. And you're right, the Manchester United, the Chelseas, etc., they're down. It's 89 minutes. There's 1 minute left on the clock plus extra time. And everybody knows they're going to find a way to score a goal or two. And it's the same in tennis. Djokovic and the Federers and even Murray's these days playing against Wawrinkas and others. You get to the final stages, and by and large, the top four will find a way to win, and by and large, the challengers will find a way to lose. And the challengers are obviously not bad. They are elite. They're world class. Against others, they will find a way to win. So I think where I'm coming from, there is a skill in learning how to win, just like there is a skill in doing your first serve or your forehand. And the more you practice the skill, the better you are at it. So the Djokovic and the top four, I don't think arguably, the top four have probably the same level of skill and power in their shots as the top 10, possibly even the top 100. Thomas interviewed somebody well down the line who thought his shots were as good as the top 10. But one is better at winning as distinct from better at playing better.
You're absolutely right. And one of the things, just to take it one step further, Mark, the top tennis players, the top guys, the Djokovic and the Nadals, and so many times when you're dealing with players who are not at a very high level, and even you will have players that would say, well, I don't want to play against this guy because I'm better than he is. Okay? But, every time Nadal or Djokovic or Federer steps on the court, they're playing against someone who is not as good as they are. But they still have this mentality of learning how to win. And too many times you have the club players who are going around and saying, I don't want to play with this guy because I'm better. But, the top guys, there's no one better for them to play. So they're always playing down and they have figured out a way how to win over and over, whereas the club player is always thinking, I need to find someone better to compete against. If you learn how to compete and beat those guys, you are then going to be a top tennis player.
I've never heard this before, but I think it's fantastic. Thomas, any drills that we have that can simulate this pressure, so that when there is real pressure, we can just trigger our little memory and away we go?
Yes, well, we simulate point situations where we narrow down the court a little bit for the returner so that the server is able to hit as many forehands as he can after the first serve. So if we leave everything open, then the returner can, of course, play anywhere. And then we cannot really focus on this exact pattern that we want to practice, which is serve and a forehand typically to the open court. So one of our drills is we narrow down the court for the returner. We make it a little bit more narrow, and the returner has to return down the middle, and the server has to hit a forehand off that return. So that's tactically. And of course, in terms of the pressure, we use different types of scoring to increase the pressure on the server. For example, the server has to win 2 points to win 1 point or something like that. And so we always use scoring to create pressure, and we use a certain tactical pattern so that we practice this as many times as possible in a row.
Okay, and only allow one serve?
Yes, we can also do only one serve, yes.
Okay. Can we just step into the returner server's shoes for a second now? But this is a combat situation, gunslingers. One's got all the aces and one's got nothing. How does one deal with it as a returner server? First serve, 30-40. Robert?
Yes, well, the returner eventually, if he doesn't learn immediately, will eventually learn the preferred pattern of the server, which is the serve and the forehand. And so he is looking to neutralize. And so one way to neutralize is to play deep down the middle, or possibly to the backhand, so possibly not to what the server wants. Any thoughts, Robert, on that? What would you suggest to the returner if he plays a player that likes to do a serve and a forehand?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100% on that. You want to go ahead and, as often as possible, play your strengths and have you play towards the opponent's weakness. So you want to match your strengths with their weaknesses. So if you're noticing that it may not necessarily be the best pattern of return to hit the ball down the line to the backhand or something like that, but if the player is struggling with their backhand, it's absolutely try to target their weakness as early as possible. So I think that's a very good point that you brought up.
Yes, and the first thing I think perhaps is for the returner, because it happens. We're talking about club level players most of the time here, and it's very important that they start to look for patterns, because sometimes in the heat of the battle, they basically just see one shot and then one shot and then one shot, and they're in kind of reactive mode. And they might not actually see the pattern, what is the preferred pattern of the server. So I think step one for the returner is to actually think about, is there a pattern happening, and why is my opponent, namely the server, always able to dictate the point with his forehand? What's really going on? So I think that's maybe step one, that you realize, wait a minute, something's going on that I don't like. And then how am I going to counter it? So as a little anecdote that I want to share is I once played a league in our team. And so I finished my match and I'm watching my teammate play. So that's recreational tennis league. So I'm watching my teammate play. And he loses the first set 6-1. So I'm standing behind the fence behind. I'm looking what he's doing. So he comes to me after 6-1. He comes to me and he says, I just realized my opponent is a lefty. I've been playing to his backhand all the time. Now I realize that's his forehand. So he was a fairly experienced player. And in the heat of the battle, he didn't see that his opponent was a lefty. And so, you know, if we go...
And you're absolutely right.
Yeah. It's possible that we don't even spot the pattern that our opponent is actually doing something to set up his forehand. So just wanted to point this out, that it's important that we become aware of what is actually going on, and then how are we going to counter it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. And, you know, too many times we talk about, I would talk about it also in relation to the serve. You know, you want to go ahead and take your time before you go ahead and return, so that you are aware. So what's the point? You win the point. You take some time, reflect. Don't just run up to the baseline and get ready for the next return, right? Or the serve. You want to take your time so that you can notice these things. Well, I noticed that my player is left-handed, and I noticed these different patterns. But, you know, especially with club players and also with junior players, I would like to bring this up also, because it's the same situation. As soon as the point is over, you know, they're rushing to go ahead and serve as quickly as possible. And many times you're absolutely right. You will not notice whether your opponent is right or left-handed. So it is really, really crucial for you to take that time. The other thing is with the return, similar to the forehand, Mark, I go ahead and I always like to talk about the return as you have to wait until the return isn't completed until you're done with the fourth ball. So I want to hit my return, and then I want my opponent to hit the ball back to me, and then I go with the fourth ball. I'm not done, so I have to keep my footwork ready. I have to anticipate the fourth ball. And with that in mind, I need to also go ahead and, I apologize, we have a big rainstorm here, so I'm going to try to go inside.
All right. Mark can take over now.
Joyce of Florida. Who says this wasn't live?
Absolutely. But, yeah, so you want to go ahead and, okay.
Good.
I am indoors. Okay, I'll find a quiet place
Don't
here
worry.
inside.
I think we're nearly done. Thomas, anything to say on the return of serve to Roberts?
Yeah, we were talking about, you know, tactically how to neutralize the server, but also I mentioned that, you know, in the first place, you actually have to become aware that the server actually has a plan, you know, that the server is actually doing something to you instead of accidentally just happening to hit a forehand after your return. So that you actually realize, wait a minute, the server is actually setting up his forehand with the serve. So, you know, before you can counter something, before you can neutralize, you have to realize that something is going on that is not to your advantage. So we were just discussing that the returner has to look for patterns that keep happening and realize, wait a minute, what's happening? And then realize that this is the pattern. My opponent is serving in a way so that he can immediately attack with the forehand. So only when you are aware that something is going on, then you can think about the ways to neutralize that. That was our little conclusion. And we also mentioned, I mentioned an anecdote that it is possible that your opponent, I mean, sometimes the player doesn't even realize that his opponent is a left-hander. So we have to keep our eyes open and not just react to one ball at a time, but actually try and see what are the patterns that are happening to me, or what Brad Gilbert said in his book. He said, who is doing what to whom? So you have to realize, wait a minute, what's going on? What is my opponent doing to me? rather than just seeing one ball coming over and then hitting that ball and then waiting and not seeing any patterns of play.
Okay. And the returner server, I presume, apart from just trying to get the ball back, is trying to neutralize.
Yes, exactly. In this case, because we're talking about the first serve, so we would rarely suggest attack or counter-attack. So yes, our main goal is to neutralize the server and prevent him from attacking with the forehand immediately after the return.
Okay. Robert, anything to say? Because if we said most things, I'll just summarize.
No, I think what you what Thomas said, and also the comments that you made, Mark, are spot on. And we're talking again about the first serve here, and we're not talking about different surfaces and so on, because in that situation, the returner can be a little bit more aggressive. We also are not we're talking here about male tennis players, because generally speaking, female tennis players, we haven't addressed that, but female tennis players tend to, as the quote goes, return to win the game, whereas male players serve to win the match, or serve to return to win. So you notice that female tennis players, generally speaking, have a better return of serve than they have a serve. Okay, so female tennis players tend to, again, return to win the match, and you see many more breaks in the female game versus the male game. The male game, you see players serve, they're stronger with the serve and so on. But you're absolutely right. I just wanted to touch on that particular topic.
So we haven't really discussed too much on technique, and that's best left for the court. But suffice to say that technique, of course, is important at the end of the day. And in our various drills, the difference is that we will practice very prescriptive serves and expect a second serve. And we'll also practice prescriptive returns of serve and prepare for the next shot. So just want to park that. And really my conclusions are 3 takeaways for this, for club players to start practicing, is that 1, it is most important that you've done the training based on evidence to believe that this is an exciting time. It is your opportunity to close out. It's not something that you should be anxious, nervous, or fearful about. And as I said, whatever happens next, if you're fearful, if you're playing not to lose, you will probably lose. And I have a quote which I can probably read out actually because it's really important. It's between Virgil and Dumas, both of whom are great philosophers. One was a Roman poet called Virgil, and one was a French author called Alexander Dumas, and both very famous. So the poet Virgil observed, "They are able who think they are able." And Alexander Dumas saw the other side of the same coin and says, "When people doubt themselves, they make their own failure certain by themselves being the first to be convinced of it." So clearly, if you train yourself to be Virgil and you're serving out, you're going to do a lot better than if you train yourself to be Dumas. And as it's all in language, word creates world, that's part of the training. So that's part of the training. The second part, and the great observation, is that this is a 2-step sequence, and you're serving in order to set up your forehand. And I think the third takeaway from Robert is that in our training, we're training to close out, we're training to win, so that is burnt in our DNA, and repetition builds strength. And yet again, we can bring that out when it counts most. So whilst we talked a lot of things, I think those are the 3 really key points. Again, my honour to be in Exalted Company. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Thomas. And no doubt,
thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Gladiator camps coming up, and Robert, Thomas, of course, will be involved in the Gladiator online training. So we'll be seeing more of each other. Robert, thank you very much with all your difficulties and the heat, the humidity, the internet. Thanks for your smiling and your calm demeanour. A big point player, obviously.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
I enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you, Thomas.
Robert.
The purpose of this drill is to improve the efficiency of the first forehand shot after the serve. The key to getting into a dominating position in the rallies is to strike first after the serve. If the serve is effective, it may result in a direct winner, but more often than not you will get a short ball from which you can start building the point. And since for most players, even on the Pro Tour, the forehand is the bigger shot, your goal is to use it immediately after the serve. And the more effective your first forehand strike is, the more you will hurt your opponent with that first shot. The following drills isolate this situation and focus on the inside-out and inside-in forehand attacks. Let's start on the deuce side first. After serving wide and pulling your opponent wide, the whole right side of the court is open. And since the majority of returns are aimed down the middle, you'll need to run around your backhand and hit an inside-out forehand into the open court. If your forehand is effective, then your opponent will most likely reach the ball in a difficult position and again play back a weak shot. This allows you to dominate the rally and win most of the points from this situation in the long term. The drill starts by player A feeding the ball from the deuce sideline and aiming it short towards the middle of the court. Player B starts a meter or so from the center of the court towards the deuce side as he simulates his position after the serve. That way he also practices running around the backhand from a slightly more challenging position, which helps him improve more in the long term. After player A feeds the ball, he moves towards the center of the court in order to cover it properly. Player B has to use his forehand and attack into the open court. After that first shot, the point is open. The goal of player A is to neutralize this first strike and push player B back into a neutral position, while player B looks to retain the advantage in the rally and eventually win the point. Since the ball is always short because of player A's feed, there's no anticipation or decision process. This drill's purpose is to improve the footwork as well as accuracy and consistency of the first forehand strike in the rally. There's one technical, or we can call it a footwork point, that you should keep in mind. When you run around the ball to hit a forehand, imagine getting behind the ball in relation to where you will play it. The most common mistake in this situation is that the player tries to angle the ball into the open court, mostly with his racket face, while his body orientation still faces the net. So he is positioned the same as if he was hitting down the line, or let's say perpendicular to the net, but the shot requires him to hit slightly diagonally. When the player doesn't align behind the ball with the body, the resulting forehand is very inaccurate and most of the times you don't get the angle you want, so the ball ends up too close to the middle of the court. So instead of thinking only of the racket face position behind the ball, think more about your body getting behind the ball and orienting towards the target. The process of working on the inside-in forehand is exactly the same, except it's being done from the other side. Player A now feeds the ball from the ad side, while player B starts in the middle of the court and has to run around his backhand to hit an inside-in forehand down the line. Player A of course tries to reach the ball and neutralize player B's first attack, while player B looks to build upon this first attacking shot and continue to dominate the rallies with his forehand. The technical part in this case is slightly easier, as the body orientation when hitting inside in is very much like the usual forehands the player hits, but what you should keep in mind is getting enough distance from the ball. The incoming ball is in this case coming closer and closer to you, and if you don't create enough space when moving around in the beginning, you may end up jammed as the ball will come too close to you. Therefore move well away from the ball when you start your preparation for the inside-in forehand, so that when the ball reaches your contact zone, you'll be positioned at an optimal distance from the ball. Here's how to practice. Player A feeds the ball from the deuce sideline and aims it short towards the middle of the court. Player B starts about a meter from the center of the court towards the deuce side as he simulates his position after the serve. Player B runs around his backhand and attacks with the forehand into the open court, while player A moves towards the ball. The goal for player B is to win the point by dominating the rallies, mostly with his forehand, while player A's goal is to neutralize player B's attacks and turn the point into his favor. Players play 6 points from this situation before they switch roles. They repeat this whole process twice, then they follow the same procedure from the other side, where player A feeds the ball from the deuce side, and player B has to attack with an inside-in forehand to start the rally. The total duration of all drills is around 20 minutes.